Holocaust survivors, Your Majesties, dear Holocaust survivors, Your Royal Highnesses, Your Majesties, Your Excellencies, Your Royal Highnesses, Prime Minister, Your Excellencies, President of Parliament, Presidents, Representative of many and President delegations of Parliament here from the heights of Yad Vashem, next to the Herzl Mountain. I would like to express my words in Hebrew, and you have a direct translation. So if you are ready with a direct translation, I'll start. ב-27 בינואר 1945 נפתחו שערי הגיהנום. אושוויץ, המפעל הגדול ביותר בתולדות האנושות להשמדת עם. So if you are ready with a direct translation, I'll start.
On the 27th of January 1945, the gates of hell were opened, Auschwitz. That greatest enterprise in the history of mankind for the extermination of a people was liberated. The atrocities that were shown and revealed to the Red Army troops were absolutely incomprehensible, intolerable. Zinovi Kolochevo, a Jew, an artist, and a soldier in the Red Army, described what he saw with his own eyes. The earth is sighing with the atrocities that those victims suffered. I could not tear myself from that portion of the land that was cursed in the history of mankind. All my body was horrified, and I was moaning and sobbing bitterly. Thus he wrote, in the camp itself, there were bodies, thousands of people dying and dead. Yes, some of them children too, many, many children. There were half-naked skeletons, some of them Muslims, emaciated. 1,600,000 human beings were in Auschwitz. Nearly 1.5 million of them were Jews. They were all slaughtered. 1,600,000 human beings, 1.5 million of them were Jews. On a little piece of paper with a pencil, a corporal Dolcachetto wrote on this little slip of paper, and he wrote and wrote and reiterated again and again so that it would be remembered, so that he would never forget, so that he would never forget, that he would always remember. We too are here standing, kings, leaders, statesmen, heads of states and government here in Yad Vashem, Jerusalem, in order to remember and never forget. On behalf of the Jewish people, and here as the President of the State of Israel, I would like to thank you from the bottom of my heart for having come here. Thank you for your solidarity with the Jewish people, for your commitment to remember the Shoah, for your commitment to the citizens of the world, for those who believe in freedom and the dignity of mankind. At the end of November 1943, for the first time in Tehran, the three superpower leaders met, those who had actually waged that war in Germany. That was not just a meeting of friends, not at all. It was one with tremendous suspicions embedded in it, suspicions and suspiciousness because there was an abyss of differences between them. But those three leaders chose. They chose because it was incumbent upon them to choose, to elevate themselves above the controversies because of one such elevated objective of the Nazi regime being totally destroyed. For the sake of mankind, that was what the alliance was for the sake of humanity, for millions of human beings, of my people who were exterminated and slaughtered in the Shoah, and hundreds of thousands of millions who died, the victims of the Second World War. The Allies chose too late. Alongside that, they succeeded in facing the Nazi monster and saying, no more. At the end of the day, freedom and dignity and an alliance for the sake of life, they are the ones that became victorious over the Second World War, and that is not to be taken for granted. What would have happened in a world wherein the Allies would not have united, in a world wherein the racist theory would have been the superpower that would have overruled everything? Well, we are here today, and we knew what the international arena was able to do, united in order to fight together for one objective, and what they can do today, and they will continue acting together based on those shared common values, fighting against racism and anti-Semitism, against radical forces that are disseminating chaos and destruction and hatred. We must stand side by side as a wall, shoulder to shoulder, against it for the sake of humanity and humankind. At the end of the Second World War, the era of responsibility actually was embarked upon. In other words, after the atrocities of the Holocaust and the war, the states chose to conduct themselves with responsibility. The national democracies have always reacted, and the fruit that have been harvested have been in accordance with that. After all, enlightenment and eradication of disease. We should never see in democracy something to be taken for granted. It is not thus. We must distance ourselves from remembering that destruction and the Holocaust and the Second World War. But it is incumbent upon us to remember, even nowadays, dear distinguished guests, the esteemed heads of states here, we must sense and we need that responsibility. My distinguished guests, the Jewish people is a people that remembers. We remember not because we have a sense of supremacy, and not in order to sort of just think about those atrocities the whole time and the self-justice, no. But we remember because we understand that if we do not remember, then history can be repeated. Not only human beings burned in those horrible ovens in Auschwitz, but liberty, freedom, and human solidarity also came up in that smoke through the chimneys. The Nazi Germany tried to slaughter and exterminate the people, hoping to eradicate the Jews and get rid of them, wipe them off the map. But there, the Nazi racist views caused the death of over 66 million human beings, men and women. Let us not be confused. Anti-Semitism does not only stop with Jews, but racism and anti-Semitism is a malignant disease that dismantles people and states and countries, and no society, no democracy is immune to that. My dear distinguished guests, the state of Israel is not a compensation for the Holocaust. It was not incepted in order to compensate them for the events that took place, but it was established because it is our homeland, the homeland of the Jewish people. And we came from there and always returned to it after 2,000 years, a millennia of exile. Israel is a strong democracy, a strong democracy, and yes, a very proud member in the League of Nations, not waiting for redemption, but waiting for partnership that demands partnership, a fully fledged one in the struggle and battle against anti-Semitism, the new and the old one that is looming above us now in a different shape. They're talking about national purity and the hate, xenophobia, and that is taking a terrible toll and price in the lives of people. It is a chronic disease. It is from the right, emanating from the left too, changing shape, metamorphosing itself. Anti-Semitism has not changed. Yes, but we have. The state of Israel is no longer, is not a victor. We will always defend ourselves in our country, and because this is the homeland and the state of the Jewish people, and it will always be responsible for the Jewish communities abroad, for their safety and security. The State of Israel is an integral part of the International League of Nations, and we make sure that we're going to strengthen scientific and moral and other values for the entire world. We intend to curb all the terror forces that want to actually wreak terror and chaos around the world. All the citizens of the world who believe in freedom can be detrimentally affected by that, and thus we will continue conducting ourselves. I would like to thank you once again. A vote of gratitude to statesmen, ladies and gentlemen, true partners, for having come here on behalf of the people of Israel, the government of Israel, the Knesset of Israel, the law of Israel, and the IDF. I would like to thank you once again for having come here. We would like to thank you for your commitment to the security of the Jewish communities, especially in such dire times. We would like to thank all those who have already adopted the anti-Semitic new definition by IHRA. And we are calling upon all the countries of the world who have not as yet adopted to adopt it. It is a very useful tool in the battle against anti-Semitism on an educational and on a public level, but also on the enforcement level. Together, all of us will continue striving to struggle and combat anti-Semitism, racism, hatred for the sake of hatred. We will struggle against denial of the Holocaust and forgetting it. We will continue educating our children and ensure that history will not be repeated, because the era of such accountability and responsibility of all of us here has not concluded. My distinguished, dearest dearly beloved Holocaust survivors who are with us here today. You are our miracle. And what your strength, I saw as a child how you came to Israel, built houses, established new families, planted trees, and you, with what you suffered, you promised us our future in a democratic and Jewish and democratic state, all entwined together. No, there is no such thing as a Jewish state without democracy, for we Jews can only live in a democratic state, and thus we will continue. The love of humankind and your love of Israel, they are our moral compass that we will follow in the footsteps of. May the victims, our brothers, our brethren, be blessed. All those who struggled against the Nazis, the righteous among the nations, and their descendants of many families are here with us. And I know of those heads of state, know them well. They are here amongst us. And we know that they are all engraved in our hearts ad infinitum. We thank you from the bottom of our hearts for this partnership in your fight for remembrance and the eradication of and your commitment to the eradication of anti-Semitism, racism, and hatred.
Thank you, President Rivlin. Ladies and gentlemen, His Excellency Vladimir
That was the speech of Israeli President Reuven Rivlin, who's been opening the day's events here, this gathering of world leaders here at Yad Vashem in Jerusalem. To speak, we see Russian President Vladimir Putin just entering the room here now, and he also due to speak shortly at the event here. Next up is Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to start things off here as the slate of speakers commences. We'll also hear, as we mentioned, from Vladimir Putin, from Vice President Mike Pence of the United States, from French President Emmanuel Macron, and others in attendance here now. We're seeing there's Prince Charles, and we see the really top tier of world leaders and foreign delegations that have come in to pay respects on the 75th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz here. And next up here, Prime Minister Netanyahu. Let's listen in.
The President of the State of Israel, thank you for having initiated and convening this important conference. My brethren, the Holocaust survivors, distinguished guests, the righteous amongst the nations,
who risked not only their own lives, but the lives of their families to save Jews during the Holocaust. The trees on this hallowed ground of Yad Vashem are a testament to their remarkable, extraordinary courage. Your Majesties, Your Royal Highnesses, Presidents, Mr. Vice President, Prime Ministers, and the many distinguished guests and dignitaries assembled here. Your presence in Jerusalem honors the memory of the 6 million victims of the Holocaust. Israel and the Jewish people, thank you. Auschwitz וירושלים תהום ופסגה.
Auschwitz and Jerusalem,
Auschwitz,
an
ההשמדה,
abyss and a summit. Auschwitz, the
ירושלים,
destruction. Jerusalem, the resurrection.
אושוויץ, השעבוד.
Auschwitz was the incarceration,
ירושלים,
enslavement.
החירות.
Jerusalem is freedom,
Auschwitz,
liberty.
המוות.
Auschwitz was death.
ירושלים,
Jerusalem
החיים.
is life.
לפני 75 שנים יצא
75
עמנו,
years ago, our
היהודי,
people, the Jewish people,
מגיא ההריגה הגדול
were liberated
בתולדות
from the
האנושות.
valley of death. It was the biggest ever,
הניצולים
the greatest ever in the
אינם
history of
שוכחים
mankind. No one of those
את חוסר
who
האונים,
survived have forgotten a thing.
את הסבל
The
האינסופי,
helplessness, the insufferable
את
moments that
הלהבות
never
והעשן,
ended, the flames,
את
the
השכול
smoke,
והאובדן.
and the mourning, the
בד
loss.
בבד,
Slowly
הם
but
זוכים
surely, at the
בהכרת תודה
same
עמוקה
time, they feel
יום
a
השחרור,
tremendous vote of gratitude
כניסת הצבא
for the
האדום
day of the
לאושוויץ,
liberation when the Red Army
את ההקרבה
marched into
העצומה של
Auschwitz.
בעלות הברית,
That tremendous sacrifice of the allies,
והעמים
of the
כאחד.
soldiers and the people.
אני בא לכאן
I am here
עם הנשיא
today
ריבלין והנשיא פוטין
with President Rivlin and
טקס
President
מרגש
Putin from a very moving
של חלוקת
ceremony
אנדרטה לזכר
of the
חללי
inauguration
המצור על לנינגרד.
of a monument
זוהי דוגמה אחת
after the siege of Leningrad.
המחיר הבלתי
And
נתפס
that is one of the intolerable actual realizations of what that victory over the Nazism was. But on such a day, it is incumbent upon us to say, for the 6 million people of our people, 1.5 million children amongst them, that those gates of hell were broken into too late. And therefore, in the foundation of the resurrection and this inception of the State of Israel, there is one decree: there will never be another Holocaust. As a Prime Minister of the State of Israel, that is my most supreme commitment.
Israel is eternally grateful to the immense sacrifice that was made by the allies, by the peoples and the soldiers, to defeat the Nazis and save our common civilization. Without that sacrifice, there would be no survivors today. Yet we also remember that some 80 years ago, when the Jewish people faced annihilation, the world largely turned its back on us, leaving us to the most bitter of fates. For many, Auschwitz is the ultimate symbol of evil. It is certainly that. The tattooed arms of those who passed under its infamous gates, the piles of shoes and eyeglasses seized from the dispossessed in their final moments, the gas chambers and crematoria that turned millions of people into ash. All these bear witness to the horrific depths to which humanity can sink. But for the Jewish people, Auschwitz is more than the ultimate symbol of evil. It is also the ultimate symbol of Jewish powerlessness. It is the culmination of what can happen when our people have no voice, no land, no shield. Today, we have a voice, we have a land, and we have a shield. Today, our voice is heard in the White House and in the Kremlin, in the halls of the United Nations and the American Congress, in London, Paris, and Berlin, and in countless capitals around the world, many of them represented here by you. Today, we have a land, our ancient homeland, which we brought back to life, to which we ingathered the exiles of our people and in which we built an advanced and powerful state. And today, we have a shield, and what a shield it is. Time after time, the strength of our arms, the courage of our soldiers, and the spirit of our people have prevailed against those who sought to destroy us. Our hand is extended in peace to all our neighbors, and a growing number of them are seizing it to build with Israel bridges of hope and reconciliation. Ladies and gentlemen, the Jewish people have learned the lessons of the Holocaust, always to take seriously the threats of those who seek our destruction, to confront threats when they are small, and above all, even though we deeply, deeply appreciate the great support of our friends, to always have the power to defend ourselves by ourselves. We have learned that Israel must always remain the master of its fate. The Jewish state has learned the lessons of the Holocaust, as the world learned the lessons of the Holocaust. There are some signs of hope, and this extraordinary gathering is one of them. Today, the dangers of racism, hateful ideologies, and anti-Semitism are better understood. Many recognize a simple truth, that what starts with the hatred of the Jews doesn't end with the Jews. Represented here today are governments that understand that confronting anti-Semitism in all its forms protects their societies as well. And Israel deeply appreciates this. We also appreciate, as many understand, as President Macron said yesterday, that anti-Zionism is merely the latest form of anti-Semitism. These are all real signs of hope and understanding and cognizance of how to protect our civilization and our world. And yet I am concerned. I'm concerned that we have yet to see a unified and resolute stance against the most anti-Semitic regime on the planet, a regime that openly seeks to develop nuclear weapons and annihilate the one and only Jewish state. Israel salutes President Trump and Vice President Pence for confronting the tyrants of Tehran that subjugate their own people. The tyrants of Tehran that subjugate their own people and threaten the peace and security of the entire world. They threaten the peace and security of everyone in the Middle East and everyone beyond. I call on all governments to join the vital effort of confronting Iran. In any case, I wish to assure again our people and all our friends, Israel will do whatever it must do to defend our state, defend our people, and defend the Jewish future. Gvirotai v'rabotai,
Ladies and gentlemen, as the Prime Minister of the State of Israel, I obligate myself, I commit that those words, never again, will not be an empty slogan, but it will be an ongoing decree, an imperative that must be followed, continuing and following that voyage of resurrection that started in Isaiah's day of the dry bones, from enslavement and liberty and freedom, from Auschwitz to Jerusalem, from darkness to light, in the words of Isaiah the prophet. For the people walking in the darkness, they saw a great light. Thank you very much, one and all.
Thank you, Prime Minister Netanyahu. It is my honor to invite the founder and president of the World Holocaust Forum Foundation and president of the European Jewish Congress, Dr. Moshe Cantor, to deliver his remarks.
Your Majesties, Your Royal Highnesses, Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, and dear Holocaust survivors. I would like to begin by expressing my deepest gratitude to President Rivlin, who 2 years ago strongly supported the idea to lead the World Holocaust Forum in Jerusalem under the special partnership of Yad Vashem and European Jewish Congress. I would like to address here today just 3 points. Number one, why is anti-Semitism a threat to humanity and not only for Jewish people? Number two, what is the situation today of anti-Semitism, and especially for European Jews? And number three, what are the practical steps that must be taken to stop this threat? When granting equal rights to the Jews of France, Napoleon Bonaparte said, "The national attitude towards Jews is the barometer of society's civilization." And why is that? Historically, Jews were always among the most loyal citizens of their countries and did their best to integrate and to become pillars of society in all walks of life. Those who wanted to dismantle the fabric of society, extremists from both right and left, the Jews were always a symbol of society's foundations. Rejection of the Jews was a rejection of the world order. They were always the first target, but by no means the last. The Nazi erased 1/3 of Jewish people, 6 million. But in total, more than 60 million people were killed during the Second World War, and the world just stopped at the gates of destruction. If extremists are not stopped at the gates of anti-Semitism, they will eventually take over executive power in their states. And what is the situation today? Who could imagine that just 75 years after the Holocaust, Jews would again be afraid to walk the streets of Europe wearing Jewish symbols? Who would have imagined that synagogues would be attacked again and cemeteries desecrated and even destroyed on a regular basis? As president of the European Jewish Congress, I can only offer you a picture of communities hiding behind high fences and thick security doors. More than 80% of them feel unsafe in Europe today, while more than 40% are considering leaving Europe entirely and in recent years, 3% have done so annually. If we think about this figure for a moment, it means that at this rate, in only 30 years, there could be no Jews in Europe. What must be done? Firstly, we must educate about the Holocaust and about the dangers of anti-Semitism, racism, and xenophobia, and particularly from the very early age. Secondly, we must introduce meaningful legislation. Finally, thirdly, fully enforce it. In this regard, there is so much that we can learn from one another. For example, Germany adopted a law 2 years ago against online hate speech, addressing one of the most powerful platforms that anti-Semitism and racism today, the internet. The United States has recently addressed the growing anti-Semitism on university campuses with an executive order which permits restricting of federal funds for universities that do not combat anti-Semitism. France passed legislation against boycotts of people and products based on nationality, addressing the new type of anti-Semitism which targets the Jewish state. Just a few weeks ago, they passed a resolution acknowledging that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. Great Britain is a model of how effectively to respond to anti-Semitism. It created a task force combined of law enforcement agencies, legal institutions, and civil society organizations to effectively coordinate and act against anti-Semitism. And Russia, where we find maybe the lowest rates of anti-Semitism due to a very uncompromising long-term policy towards anti-Semitism. And anti-Semitic incidents are treated with maximum severity, therefore practically eliminating anti-Semitism in the public arena. These 5 positive examples of strong leadership should be common all over Europe and all over the world. So, to resume, we have to equate legally and practically the words and actions of anti-Semitism to the words and actions of extremism and even terrorism. Otherwise, it will be too late. When extremism takes over executive power country by country, which means your power and our mutual future. We are together today, united in our words and in our belief for a future free from anti-Semitism, racism, and xenophobia. Together, we will plant the seeds of trust and belief so that our daily prayers for salvation will be answered. I thank each and every one of you for being here, for your dedication, belief, and commitment. Thank you.
I've been watching the beginning of the world leaders' speeches here. We saw Israeli President Rivlin. We saw Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu also speak. And now that was Moshe Cantor. He's the president of the World Holocaust Forum. This is their 5th annual event commemorating the Holocaust. Specifically today, we're bringing you live this ceremony from Yad Vashem in Jerusalem, which is now commemorating 75 years since the liberation of Auschwitz here at the pivotal event. Now, we're joined in the studios. I think we have a musical interlude here. Give a moment to discuss things in the studio here before the next speaker, which, as I understand, is set to be Russian President Vladimir Putin. So we'll be sure to bring you that live here. But during this interlude here, let's introduce our next studio guest here for this next part. We're joined by Tzvi Ravner, who's the former Israeli ambassador to Poland, Ephraim Zurov, he's the head of the Simon Wiesenthal Center in Jerusalem, and Dr. Liat Stier-Livni, she's the author and senior lecturer in the Department of Culture at Superior College. Thank you all for joining us here to begin here. Let's take a look, perhaps we'll go down the line here, I guess is the way to look at it here. We're in a world, and as this has been mentioned already by some of the speakers here, with rising anti-Semitism. For us to believe it or not, in this era now, in the last years, stats on the rise, whether it's in the United States or in Europe, this has obviously come to the fore again as a top concern. How do you see this, this ceremony, this historical marker now, as a way to perhaps combat, raise awareness? How does it tie into what we're seeing globally here? Yes, please, yes. Coming from Simon Wiesenthal Center, yes, please.
Listen, I think the significance here in this respect is primarily symbolic. The problems are acute at the moment, and they have to be treated in a very, resolute way. And especially, I think the biggest problem is the social networks. And this is something that varies from country to country. For example, in the United States, it's unheard of to try and in any way limit freedom of speech. But what we're seeing is, and at the moment, we're dealing primarily with lone wolves when we're talking about anti-Semitism. Okay. Not organized movement, not so much organized movements. And social networks have given them a platform, a way to publicize what they're doing, a way to get a moment of fame, of infamy, you could say. And in theory, these are things that can be stopped, but they're not being stopped. So I would say this has to be a major area of concern.
In an event like this, obviously highlighting, bringing so much awareness to that issue. Dr. Stier-Livni here, there's been some conflicting historical revisionism around this recently, it's different, taking different angles on the narrative of World War II here, and specifically around the Holocaust. We've seen controversy out of Poland, Russia now chiming in on that. Not the only place where so many years on, we're starting to see things twisted a little bit here now. Is that a topic of grave concern, do you believe, when it comes to the memory of the Holocaust here? And is that potentially something we'll see taken head on here at an event like today?
It is a topic of great concern, but I think that we might talk about it after Putin's speech and not before it.
Sure.
I would just like to add that I think that this conference has also an educational meaning, a really great one, because we hear from recent surveys in America and in Canada about so much ignorance among young people who don't know nothing about the Holocaust. They think that the number 6 million is exaggerated. They're not Holocaust deniers. They simply don't believe it. They don't know the name of any concentration camp. They know nothing. And here so many leaders arrive in Israel and 500 journalists with them. And this topic is covered in so many countries. So educational-wise, I think it is a very important event. And let's begin here and hope it will contribute something to this ignorance in the Western world.
Yes, certainly an incredible gathering of events, a showing of support for the memory of this and the significance. Ambassador Ravner, you're now Poland, featuring so largely, obviously, discussion around this recent years' controversy, passing legislation outlining certain ways that they can be discussed. Now, Vladimir Putin specifically, but Russia really sort of sticking it to Poland, labeling them as an instigator of the war, essentially. How does that now play out on this stage here? There's been controversy, too, just last week from Polish officials who weren't so happy to see everyone coming to Jerusalem instead of Poland to commemorate this. So how are you viewing today's events in light of all your exposure to Poland and what you know about how the Poles themselves look at this?
Well, no doubt the criticism in Poland is very sharp now, and it's directed also against Israel, and mainly because of the very recent, very heated squabble between the two of them, Poland and Russia, in the last couple of months. Mind you, the 80th anniversary of the outbreak of the Second World War in September the Russians were not there, were not invited. Putin was not invited. 10 years ago, why was ambassador there? Putin was there himself. And the relations deteriorated so much since then. And Auschwitz next week, in the camp site itself, there will be no Russian representative, maybe the Russian ambassador only, no Russian leaders. And the Poles boycotting the event here in Israel. So it's very much political stuff, very much a great politicization, but here I agree that it is nevertheless, and in spite of the fact, yes, there is a politicization of the whole thing to a degree, but it is so important as to the awareness, raising the awareness, the world awareness of the Holocaust, of the memory, and the fight against anti-Semitism, educational to young, to those old who may be trying to rewrite the history in several countries, and to those youngsters who know nothing simply about the Holocaust and the Second World War.
Yes, I think something I was reading today, polls in the United States, for example, say that so many people, what they know of the Holocaust, maybe certain details, but they don't know about the human toll, about the 6 million Jews. That this is becoming knowledge lost in the history books a bit here. That such a significant moment here. Is it on this commemoration? Is this a chance? Is this a moment? Are we seeing the world show that they still care, at least the world leaders?
Listen, first of all, I want to remind people, our viewers, that 20 years ago, a similar conference was held in Stockholm. And it was convened by Göran Persson, who was the Swedish Prime Minister, in the wake of revelations regarding the abysmal ignorance of Swedish school children about the Holocaust. And at the time, there was really a lot of question marks as to what will be the effect and what will be the result of such a conference. So I'm happy to say that it's had a very important result, which is something called IRA. IRA is the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, which is now includes, I think, 31 different countries who are working very hard to promote Holocaust education. But they've also played an active role in the whole issue of anti-Semitism, because they've basically created a definition, which is probably the best definition that's ever been produced, and which has already been accepted by quite a few countries, organizations, institutions. So
there's real change that can come out of this. There's really lasting impact.
It's possible. Let's put it this way.
Well, we'll hope with such a high-level delegation or delegations here in attendance. We'll obviously be watching that aspect closely. I think we're about to go back to the ceremony here as Russian President Vladimir Putin being introduced, and we'll be taking the stage here just shortly. Let's listen in.
Invite His Excellency, Mr. Vladimir Putin, President of the Russian Federation, to deliver his remarks.
Уважаемый господин президент,
Mr. President,
уважаемый господин премьер-министр,
Prime Minister,
коллеги, друзья, дамы.
colleagues, friends, ladies, gentlemen.
Сегодня на международном форуме,
We've gathered today at this international forum to honor the memory of the Holocaust victims. It is our shared responsibility that has brought us together, the debt we owe to the past and to the future. We mourn for all the victims of the Nazism, including 6 million Jews, tortured to death in ghettos and concentration camps, atrociously slaughtered in punitive expeditions. 40% of them are citizens of the former Soviet Union. So, for us, the Holocaust has always been for us a deep wound. It is a tragedy we shall never forget. Before coming to Jerusalem, I read the authentic documents, the briefs from the officers of the Red Army after the liberation of Auschwitz. I have to tell you, colleagues, it is very difficult to read these details that speak in detail how this camp was organized, how this machinery for the cold-blooded extermination of people was working. It is almost unbearable to read. Many of them are handwritten by the soldiers and officers of the Red Army on the second, the third day after the liberation of the prisoners. And these breves give us a chance to feel the shock that they felt when they saw what was happening there. They witnessed things that made them feel pain, indignation, and compassion. Marshal Konev, who was in charge of the military operation to take the densely populated Silesian industrial area of Germany, tried to save as many civilians as possible. Once he was informed of the atrocities that were happening in Auschwitz, he forbade himself from even seeing that concentration camp. Subsequently, he wrote in his memoirs that he did not have the right to lose back then his fortitude. He did not have the right to let the righteous feeling of vengeance blind him, because that would have brought about additional victims among the innocent people that lived in Germany. January the 27th is going to mark the 75th anniversary since the liberation of Auschwitz. This hell pit where people from different countries were driven to be tortured, experimented upon, and exterminated in droves. This hell pit took the lives of hundreds of thousands of people, including more than 1 million Jews. Crimes perpetrated by Nazis, they're carefully thought through, planned. Final solution to the Jewish question, as they called it. That is, colleagues, it's one of the blackest, the most shameful pages in the world history. Nor should we forget that this crime had accomplices whose cruelty often surpassed that of their masters. Those death factories and concentration camps were operated not just by Nazis, but by their henchmen and accomplices in many European countries. It's where these thugs operated in the occupied territories of the Soviet Union that the biggest number of Jews were slaughtered. In Ukraine, 1.4 million Jews were slaughtered. In Lithuania, 220,000 people. I like to draw your attention to the fact that that is 95% of the pre-war Jewish population of Lithuania. In Latvia, 77,000 people, and so on and so forth. Just several hundreds Latvian Jews managed to survive the Holocaust. Holocaust is a deliberate extermination of people. And I have to remind you that Nazis had in store the same fate for many other nations. Russians, Belarusians, Ukrainians, Poles, other nationalities were declared as inferior people. And their lands were supposed to become a Lebensraum for Nazis, to provide them with a comfortable existence, whereas Slavonic nations were condemned either to be exterminated or to be reduced to slaves with no voice of their own, with no culture, historical memory, or language. Back then, in 1945, the end to these barbaric plans was put first and foremost by the Soviet nation. As was mentioned, it managed to protect its fatherland and brought freedom to Europe. We paid a terrible price, unheard of before by any nation. We had to sacrifice 27 million people. That was the price of victory. The memory of the Holocaust will only become a lesson and a warning if it is comprehensive and integral, with no cuts or omissions. Regrettably, right now, the memory of war and its lessons fall victim increasingly often to short-term political interest, which is absolutely inadmissible. The duty of current politicians, political leaders, citizen statement is to protect the good name of both living and fallen heroes, as well as innocent people who fell victim to Nazis and their henchmen. And to do that, we need to use all opportunities, information, political and cultural, the authority and clout of our countries throughout the world. I am confident that everyone attending the forum shares these concerns and is willing to stand together with Russia to protect the truth and justice. And we certainly all bear responsibility to make sure that the terrible tragedies of the past war should never repeat themselves. We have to make sure that future generations remember the horrors of Holocaust and concentration camps, the siege of Leningrad. As Prime Minister Netanyahu has said, we've inaugurated a monument to honor the victims of the siege of Leningrad. They have to remember Babi Yar, as well as the village of Hattin burned to the ground. They have to be vigilant not to miss when the first sprouts of hatred, of chauvinism, of xenophobia and anti-Semitism start to rear their ugly head. When we see surreptitious attempts to condone xenophobia or other manifestations of these phenomena. The oblivion of the past, fragmentation in the face of threats can bring about terrible consequences. We need to find the courage not just to speak about that directly, but also to do everything in our power to protect peace. I believe that the founding members of the United Nations should lead by example, the 5 nations incumbent upon which has special responsibility to preserve our civilization. With some of our counterparts, we've discussed this, and as far as I understand, on the whole, the attitude is positive. We suggest that a meeting should be held of the heads of state and government of the P5, Russia, China, the US, France and the UK. It can take place in any country, at any place of the world where counterparts find it convenient. Russia is willing to engage in a serious conversation, and without further ado, we are willing to send this address to the leaders of the UN Security Council P5. We have many important issues at hand. Just recently, one of those issues, Libya, was discussed in Berlin at the initiative of Chancellor Merkel, but we'll have to get back to that, to the United Nations adopt a resolution. But there are many other issues. Holding such a meeting in 2020, I believe, is going to be emblematic, as we will celebrate the 75th anniversary since the end of the Second World War, as well as since the establishment of the United Nations. A summit of nations that made the main contribution to routing the aggressor, to building a post-war world order that could play an important role in finding collective responses to the challenges and threats of today, and it would demonstrate our common devotion to alliance and also historical memory to those lofty ideals and values our forefathers fought side by side for. And in conclusion, I would like to say thank you to our Israeli colleagues for the warm and hospitable welcome here in Jerusalem, and wish the participants of the conference, as well as all citizens of Israel, peace and all the best. Thank you very much.
Thank you, President Putin. The entry of the United States into the war was critical in the Allies' fight against Nazi Germany and the other Axis powers, liberating Western Europe and ensuring the Allies' eventual victory. American soldiers freed Buchenwald, Dachau, and other Nazi concentration camps. It is my honor to invite His Excellency, Mr. Mike Pence, Vice President of the United States of America, to deliver his remarks.
President Rivlin, Prime Minister Netanyahu, Your Majesties, Presidents, Excellencies, honored survivors, and distinguished guests. It is deeply humbling for me to stand before you today on behalf of the American people as we mark the 75th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz. On this occasion, here on Mount Herzl, we gather to fulfill a solemn obligation, an obligation of remembrance, to never allow the memory of those who died in the Holocaust to be forgotten by anyone, anywhere in the world. The word remember appears no fewer than 169 times in the Hebrew Bible. For memory is the constant obligation of all generations. And today, we pause to remember what President Donald Trump rightly called the dark stain on human history, the greatest evil ever perpetuated by man against man in the long catalog of human crime. The faces of 1.5 million children reduced to smoke under a silent sky for the crime of having a single Jewish grandparent. The night Elie Wiesel, called 7 times sealed, consumed the faith of so many then and challenges the faith of so many still. Today we remember what happens when the powerless cry for help and the powerful refuse to answer. The town's name was Auschwitz. As part of their plan to destroy the very existence of Polish culture, the Nazis gave Polish towns German names, and this one they called Auschwitz. When soldiers opened the gates of Auschwitz on January 27, 1945, they found 7,000 half-starved, half-naked prisoners, hundreds of boxes of camp records that documented the greatest mass murder in history. Before the war was over, in its 5 years of existence, more than 1.1 million men, women, and children would perish at Auschwitz. As my wife and I can attest firsthand from this past year, one cannot walk the grounds of Auschwitz without being overcome with emotion and grief. One cannot see the piles of shoes, the gas chambers, the crematoriums, the lone boxcar facing the gate to the camp, and those grainy photographs of men, women, and children being sent to their deaths without asking, how could they? Today we mourn with those who mourn and grieve with those who grieve. We remember the names and the faces and the promise of the 6 million Jews who were murdered in the Holocaust. Today, we also pay tribute to those who survived, who all these years have borne witness to that evil and have served mankind by their example. And today we honor and remember the memory of all the Allied forces, including more than 2 million American soldiers who left hearth and home, suffered appalling casualties, and freed a continent from the grip of tyranny. And finally, we pay tribute to the memory of those non-Jewish heroes who saved countless lives. Those the people of Israel call the righteous among the nations. In an age of indifference, they acted. In an age of fear, they showed courage. and their memory and their example should kindle anew the flame of our hearts to do the same in our time. We must be prepared to stand as they did against the wave of their times. We must be prepared to confront and expose the vile tide of anti-Semitism that is fueling hate and violence all across the world, and we must stand together. In that same spirit, we must also stand strong against the leading state purveyor of anti-Semitism, against the one government in the world that denies the Holocaust as a matter of state policy and threatens to wipe Israel off the map. The world must stand strong against the Islamic Republic of Iran. And finally, we must have the courage to recognize all the leaders and all the nations that are gathered here, that today we have the responsibility and the power to ensure that what we remember here today can never happen again. Mr. Prime Minister, as we honor and remember the 6 million Jewish martyrs of the Holocaust, the world can only marvel at the faith and resilience of the Jewish people, who just 3 years after walking in the valley of the shadow of death, rose up from the ashes to reclaim a Jewish future and rebuild the Jewish state. And I'm proud to say, as Vice President of the United States, that the American people have been with you every step of the way since 1948. And so we will remain. As President Trump declared in his historic visit to Jerusalem, the bond between our two peoples is woven together in the fabric of our hearts. And so it shall always be. Today we remember not simply the liberation of Auschwitz, but also the triumph of freedom. A promise fulfilled, a people restored to their rightful place among the nations of the earth. And we remember the long night of that past, the survivors and the faces of those we lost, the heroes who stood against those evil times. And today we gather, nearly 50 nations strong, here in Jerusalem to say with one voice, never again. Through pogroms, persecutions, and expulsions in the ghettos, and finally even through the death camps, the Jewish people clung to an ancient promise that he would never leave you or forsake you, and that he would lead this people to inherit the land that he swore to your ancestors that he would give them. And so today, as we bear witness to the strength and the resilience and the faith of the Jewish people, so too we bear witness to God's faithfulness to the Jewish people. May the memory of the martyrs be enshrined in the hearts of all humanity for all time. May God bless the Jewish people, the state of Israel, the United States, and all the nations gathered here. And may he who creates peace in the heavens create peace for us and for all the world. Oseh Shalom Bimro Ma Huye Aseh Shalom Aleinu V'Akol Yes Israel Vayim Ru. Amen.
Now, again, thanks for joining us here. This is i24NEWS live coverage of the 75th anniversary liberation of Auschwitz memorial ceremony taking place at Yad Vashem in Jerusalem today. We're bringing you the live speeches of world leaders gathered. That was just Vice President Mike Pence from the United States. We've already heard from President Rivlin and Prime Minister Netanyahu of Israel and Vladimir Putin of Russia. Now, next up here is a video focused on the Holocaust here, put on by the World Holocaust Forum Foundation. Just a short warning to our viewers. It has graphic Holocaust imagery. Here, take a look.
European Jews were integrated into society, contributing in every field, from art and science to industry and literature. But as post-World War I Germany descended into severe economic crisis and social upheaval, Hitler saw an opportunity to seize power by turning age-old European anti-Semitic prejudice into a radical anti-Jewish ideology and policy, blaming the Jews for all of Germany's woes, excluding them from public life, introducing racial laws, and infusing every layer of society with anti-Semitic hatred. As Hitler's power grew, unchecked and unrestrained, anti-Semitic rhetoric quickly evolved into legal restrictions, boycotts, popular violence, arrests, deportations, and ghettos where Jews starved.
בצריף הזה אני למדתי איך לרעוב, איך לסבול, איך לחיות בקור, איך לחיות ברעב אדיר.
It culminated in the final solution, the systematic extermination of around 6 million Jews, including 1.5 million children.
קודם כל, הם שלחו את הנשים לתאי הגזים. נורא היום היה לשמוע את הזעקות ואת הייסורים של האנשים ושל הילדים, וזעקו מה מתתה, ואחרי כמה דקות נחנקו.
The goal was not only the annihilation of Jews, but also of Jewish history and culture, while committing the large-scale theft of Jewish property in order to fund the Nazis' heinous crimes. The Nazi war machine devoured country after country, and wherever Nazi boots tread, killing squads, labor, concentration and death camps followed. Over 1,100 ghettos and around 1,000 camps soon covered Europe.
Here we are, together, facing a group of mighty foes who seek our ruin. Here we are, together, defending all that to free men is dear.
The Allies realized that the only way to stop Hitler's armies was to join forces. The Red Army was the first to drive back the massive Nazi armies. Russian soldiers fought a powerful military, facing harsh weather conditions and major shortages of equipment and supplies. In November 1942, the Red Army begins to push the Nazis back from the gates of Stalingrad, freeing Eastern Europe from the Nazi grip, region after region. In July 1943, after freeing North Africa, American forces, together with British troops, joined the battle for Europe through Italy. On June 6, 1944, a large American force, together with British, Canadian, and Australian troops, lands on the beaches of Normandy. They advance through Western Europe, while to the south, French forces join the battles. On July 24, 1944, Soviet soldiers liberate the death camp Majdanek without yet fully understanding the dimensions of the Nazi genocide. From this point on, the Allies close in on Germany. Yet even as the Nazis retreated, they frantically worked to complete the final solution through death marches and mass exterminations of Jews.
אם אתה הולך לאושוויץ, אתה רואה, חודשיים שרפו, לא רק את כל משפחתי, 450,000 איש.
Tens of thousands would die in the death marches.
זה היה מרש בלי סוף. חשבנו שזה לעולם לא ייגמר. מי שרק נעמד לנוע 5 רגעים, ירו בה.
In 1945, the Allies, working in close cooperation, deal the final blows to the Nazi regime. The Red Army liberates Auschwitz-Birkenau, followed by the liberation of Buchenwald and Dachau by the American Army, and Bergen-Belsen by the British. The war in Europe ends with the fall of Berlin and the liberation of the last camp, Theresienstadt. As the liberators, including many Jewish soldiers, stepped through the gates of the camps, they crossed from earth into hell.
И мы открыли ворота. То, что мы там увидели, кровь, трупы и невероятно смрадный запах. В этих бараках выбегали, мы не евреи, сами они скелеты уже, и говорили: «Я не еврей».
My name is Conor Illingworth and I live in Cheshire. I was present in Belsen camp doing guard duty over the SS-men. The things in this camp are beyond describing. The things they have committed, well, nobody would think they were human at all.
Soviet, American, British, Canadian, and French soldiers that entered the camps found survivors so weak, sick, and malnourished that they could barely stand. The liberators discovered the overcrowded barracks, the rooms for medical experiments, the gas chambers, and the crematoria.
I can never forget that day, because when I walked through that gate, I saw in front of me what I call the walking dead. I saw human beings that had been beaten, had been starved, had been tortured. They'd been denied everything.
The power of unity overcame the strongest army the world has ever seen and saved humanity from the darkest evil the world had ever known.
After the fall of France to German occupation, the French underground...
Again, welcome to thanks for staying with us here at i24 News. Welcome back to our coverage of the ceremony here, marking 75 years from the liberation of Auschwitz here, as some 49 foreign delegations in Israel for this event at Yad Vashem in Jerusalem. Now, French President Emmanuel Macron due to take the speech here. He's the next up of the series of world leaders speaking at the event today. Let's listen.
Monsieur le Président de l'État d'Israël.
Mr. President of the State of Israel and a dear friend, thank you. Mr. Prime Minister,
Mesdames et Messieurs les chefs d'État et de gouvernement, Monsieur le
esteemed heads of states and governments, Your Majesties, the Chairman of Yad Vashem, and the President of the World Holocaust Forum, rabbis, Holocaust survivors, distinguished guests and friends, one and all. Words can be perceived as something negligible, but to see you all here convened already says so much. Can one have even imagined this happening nowadays? To be so united in the remembrance, in order to remember, in order to revive and bring back those memories to life. And I am so moved to mention those Holocaust survivors' presence here, and the daughters and the sons of those who were expelled, and the righteous among the nations, those who passed on their testimony, and those who have kindled the torch of ad infinitum, of eternity. You are those who have proven till this very day humanity.
Presque jour pour jour.
75 years ago,
le 27 janvier 1945,
nearly today, exactly 75 years ago, on the 27th of January 1945, the brave soldiers of the Red Army went through the gates of Auschwitz-Birkenau in Poland, the occupied Poland by Nazi Germany. Each and every one of you, in turn, described that moment of that astonishment, the shock that the entire mankind sensed and felt. But there were no celebrations, celebrating, or cries of joy heard, or even anger when they saw what they saw, but just tears of shock and silence. The peoples of Europe were exhausted after the war. It wasn't even an event for the survivors, those who remained. For them, it was some kind of relief, because the worst of everything possible had already happened. And I will relate to that, because so many children would not find their parents, and parents would not find their children ever again, because what they had experienced was something that one could not describe in words. And for so many then, it was something that couldn't even be heard, or to name it, something that one could not even imagine. And despite that, some of the survivors overcame that desire to forget by their desire to tell their story. Just as Elie Wiesel said, to tell the story of the child who in one little shelter asked his mother in hiding, quietly, quietly, can I now cry? And that beggar who in that wagon started singing so that his soul would be conveyed to another. And that little child who whispered to the grandparents and said, don't fear dying, it's not so beautiful here. After all, she was only 7. And all of these are words of truth. They indeed happened. Yes. And yes, we can convey these words, gestures, and their last breath. In order to do so, one needed to Shimon Dubnov give him that response when he said, brethren, write it all down so that we'll be able to tell it for the sake of posterity, for the future generations. We have to continue the work of Yitzhak Johnson, who in that darkness in Grenoble, he actually documented it, and he inaugurated that center. So despite those dismal darkness, they they collected and documented testimonies and reconstructed the documents and created an archives of the Jewish victims. And they were fulfilling their role while they were also trying to remain alive after those dismal times and the Nazis. In order to forget everything, you needed such power. Seld and Beata Klausfeld, for example, what power they had in order to find those names and find those the perpetrators, the murderers. All these struggles and all these fights and all these combatants, I would like to think about them with you today.
En France,
they were people who remembered. In France as well, there were horrific things in France as well. And my country and other countries, we raise our eyes to Jerusalem. There were such horrific stories and nails, but we needed a name, an institution that would award them a name, and it was Yad Vashem who immediately stood that test and did so. The victims of heroism and the Holocaust, that those who suffered in those atrocities and those who remained and survived. After all, this is not just history that one can just read it this way or another. No, there was justice. And there is history with proof and evidence. And there is life of our nations, of our states. Let us not confuse between these things so that we will not be engulfed once again into this horrific and dismal times. We must remember those names, but not in order to hate in our times, because those commit us to remember and to continue the dialogue and adhere to that. And the friendship, not hatred. What better and more greater symbol is there than to see all of us here today convened together, united, acting in that struggle, combating, forgetting, denial, or words of revenge and acts of revenge. What pride I sense when I see so many states, European states represented today, to find myself amongst the German Republic, President Steinmeier sitting here, to be beside him and so many others, and to hear you talking from here. Europe, it's incumbent upon it to remain united and to never, ever forget again, and not to actually find oneself in a state of controversy. That is a lesson also to be learned.
Et la communauté internationale ne doit rien oublier.
And the international community, it's incumbent upon them also to never remember, never to forget anything of the barbarism and the exclusion and shunning of the others, international law that is committed to protect them and was then trampled upon by the henchmen of Nazis. President Putin, yes, those 5 members, those establishing members of the United States, they carry that historic responsibility, and I share with you 75 years on to reunite and meet once again, and I sincerely hope we will succeed in doing so. After all, we are witnesses to that history, and since the end of the Second World War, we are those who must promise world order that leans upon laws and the dignity of mankind and maintaining their rights. That is something that we are committed to. We must have the unity of the international community and Europe, because after all, anti-Semitism has once again, and the scourge of it has returned. And together with anti-Semitism, that entire entourage of intolerance and xenophobia has also risen its ugly head. And I'm saying this unequivocally, anti-Semitism is not only a problem of the Jews. No, not at all. It is first and foremost the problem of the others.
Car à chaque fois dans nos histoires, il a précédé l'effondrement.
Because every single time in our history, anti-Semitism pre-emanated weakness and the weakness of democracies. Anti-Semitism led that incapability of accepting the other. It was always the very first expression of the exclusion of others. Every time anti-Semitism appeared, then racism also flourished, and all that was chaotic, and no one could become a victor in all that. Yes, we are here today, we have convened today, because with this new anti-Semitism, we should never give up. We should continue fighting. Moshe, dear Moshe Cantor, you mentioned that each and every one of us in our own countries, through laws, texts, statements, and through vigilance, we must maintain that order in the virtual world as well, because the vitriol is heard there, and we have to be we must understand that that is what's happening, and we should be vigilant about it and stop it and curb it. We must believe that nowadays we should not let our children, who are now again entrapped in those same hatred discourses, we thought it was behind us, but no. Here, our presence in Yad Vashem, that in itself, and the presence of our youth here at Yad Vashem, that in itself embeds within it is a revival of those, because after all, we've just seen that horrific revival of such horrible things. So we must ensure that hatred and racism is poison that has such a toxic effect, and those who believe in it and those who are with it, they become accomplices. I truly believe that education
contre les haines contemporaines
is our antidote. Yes, that will protect us against anti-Semitism. One of the greatest French authors condemned those people who sort of became indifferent, those people who simply enabled things to happen and stood by in silence. But we will not allow that to happen, because we will promise remembrance and we promise to take steps. Remember and do not forget.
Souviens-toi, n'oublie jamais.
Remember, do not forget ever. This oath
Elle a gravé la mémoire de la Shoah dans le marbre de ses lois.
The French Republic is adopting it and cherishing it and engraving it on its banner in its hearts and teaching it in its schools and writing the names of those children, commemorating their names on our plaques. President Chirac, who recognized that, said that this was unforgivable, the way the Jewish French Jews were expelled, and we owe so much to those who in the churches and villages of France hid those children and Jews and adults. 240,000 were saved when 11,000 were expelled to the death camps. France knows exactly what they owe to that resilience and what unites.
Face à eux, la réponse implacable de notre
Those who try and give up will find against them our perseverance as a nation. Those who survive, they are heroes, and they are now conveying things, passing it forward and on to the future generations. And our children will also have to become those who will also convey that message. They will become the witnesses of the witnesses and never give that role up, because thanks to what they will learn, they will become those who have the power of knowledge. They know that we do not have the right or the privilege of forgetting, and the stories of our victims is a story that is a vibrant, vital one and a crucial one that must be passed on. This will be awe-inspiring to these children, because our children will have to protect and defend democracy and humanity that is so fragile and delicate, and one must fortify it time and time again. So we are uniting here today once again in order to draw that inspiration and award it to our youth, so that they will find in their hearts the valor, the courage, so that on the day that they need to, they will be able to stand strong and defend our values, and they too will be able to say, through knowledge, that everything they saw and experienced and understood, never again, never again.
Thank you, President Macron. While Germany sought to break British resolve through brutal bombings, the United Kingdom remained steadfast. British forces, together with those of other allies, drove the Nazis back through North Africa and Europe and liberated Bergen-Belsen and other German concentration camps. It is my honor to invite His Royal Highness, the Prince of Wales, to deliver his remarks.
Survivors of the Shoah, President Rivlin, Your Majesties, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it is a particular honor, although one of the most solemn kind, to be present here today and on behalf of the United Kingdom to commemorate all those so tragically lost in the Shoah. To come to this sacred place, Yad Vashem, a memorial and a name, is to be faced with that for which no name, no words, and no language can ever possibly do justice. The magnitude of the genocide that was visited upon the Jewish people defies comprehension and can make those of us who live in the shadow of those indescribable events feel hopelessly inadequate. The scale of the evil was so great, the impact so profound, that it threatens to obscure the countless individual human stories of tragedy, loss, and suffering of which it was comprised. That is why places like this and events like this are so vitally important. For many of you here, and for Jewish people across the globe, those stories are your stories. Whether you witnessed and somehow endured the appalling barbarity of the Holocaust personally, or whether it touched your lives
through the experience of your loved ones, or through the loss of parents, grandparents, uncles, aunts, or other family you were never able to know. But we must never forget that they are also our story, a story of incomprehensible inhumanity, from which all humanity can and must learn. For that an evil cannot be described does not mean that it cannot be defeated. That it cannot be fully understood does not mean that it cannot be overcome. And so it is of particular significance that we should gather here in Israel, where so many of those who survived the Holocaust sought and found refuge and built a new future for themselves and this country. In the same way, it has been a singular privilege throughout my life to have met so many Holocaust survivors who were welcomed to the United Kingdom and who began new lives there, contributing immeasurably to the welfare of our country and the world in the years that followed. I have such inspiring memories of remarkable people, such as Anita Lasker-Wallfisch, who somehow survived both Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen before moving to Britain after the war. There, as a wonderfully talented cellist, she co-founded the English Chamber Orchestra, of which I am proud to have been patron for the past 43 years. On her arm, she bears the number by which tyranny had sought to make her less than human. Yet through her music, she reminds us of the greatest beauty of which we are capable. Over the years, she has shared her story bravely and powerfully, determined that some good might come from the unspeakable evil she endured and overcame. From the horror, she brought harmony, healing, and hope. Just as each life lost in the Shoah stands for all the millions who died, each inspirational story such as that of Anita Lasker-Wallfisch stands for the strength of spirit, the unparalleled courage, the determined defiance of the very best of humanity when confronted with the very worst. For my own part, I have long drawn inspiration from the selfless actions of my dear grandmother, Princess Alice of Greece, who in 1943, in Nazi-occupied Athens, saved a Jewish family by taking them into her home and hiding them. My grandmother, who is buried on the Mount of Olives, has a tree planted in her name here at Yad Vashem and is counted as one of the righteous among the nations. Hasidei Umot Olam, a fact which gives me and my family immense pride. Ladies and gentlemen, almost a lifetime has passed since the horror of the Holocaust unfolded on the European continent, and those who bore witness to it are sadly ever fewer. We must, therefore, commit ourselves to ensuring that their stories live on, to be known and understood by each successive generation. Anita Lasker-Wallfisch has said, "There is a risk that the Holocaust will be placed under a glass bubble, just like the Napoleonic Wars or the 30 Years' War. But if we don't make the connection between memories of past atrocities and the present, there isn't any point to it. She is, it seems to me, absolutely right. The Holocaust must never be allowed to become simply a fact of history. We must never cease to be appalled nor moved by the testimony of those who lived through it. Their experience must always educate and guide and warn us. The lessons of the Holocaust are searingly relevant to this day. 75 years after the liberation of Auschwitz-Birkenau, hatred and intolerance still lurk in the human heart, still tell new lies, adopt new disguises, and still seek new victims. All too often, language is used which turns disagreement into dehumanization. Words are used as badges of shame to mark others as enemies, to brand those who are different as somehow deviant. All too often, virtue seems to be sought through verbal violence. All too often, real violence ensues, and acts of unspeakable cruelty are still perpetrated around the world against people for reasons of their religion, their race, or their beliefs. Knowing as we do the darkness to which such behavior leads, we must be vigilant in discerning these ever-changing threats. We must be fearless in confronting falsehoods and resolute in resisting words and acts of violence. We must never rest in seeking to create mutual understanding and respect. We must tend the earth of our societies so that the seeds of division cannot take root and grow. And we must never forget that every human being is B'Tselem Elohim, in the image of God. And even a single human life is Ke'olam Malay, like an entire universe. The Holocaust was an appalling Jewish tragedy, but it was also a universal human tragedy, and one which we compound if we do not heed its lessons. On this day, in this place, and in memory of the millions who perished in the Shoah, let us recommit ourselves to tolerance and respect, and to ensuring that those who lived through this darkness will forever, as in the words of the prophet Isaiah, be a light unto the nations to guide the generations that follow.
And you were here with us at i24NEWS. Our live coverage of the ceremony at Yad Vashem today is some 49 world delegations here in Israel, many heads of state here for the 75th commemoration of the liberation of Auschwitz. We've been hearing from some consequential world leaders here. I'd love to get our guests' thoughts about it. Sitting so quietly through all these speeches, Dr. Stu Livni, I wanted to bring up Mike Pence with you a bit here. You know, he's some wonderful sentiments here. Certainly put the focus on Iran at one point. Didn't address American anti-Semitism right now, at least not that I caught. Bringing up the scourge of anti-Semitism right now. What did you think of the Vice President's words here today?
Not only he, all these leaders, these are canonical narratives. And when you give such a canonical narrative, you cannot talk about things that can hinder the state. So when Putin talks, he cannot completely forgets about the first 2 years of the war when the USSR invaded Poland. He completely forgets about Katyn. He completely forgets about the Red Army not intervening in the Polish revolt and letting Warsaw just go on fire. He completely forgets about the Red Army sex crimes, not only against civil population, but also against former inmates of concentration camps. Now, Joe Biden talked so beautifully about 1.5 million Jews murdering under this silent sky. And maybe the sky were silent because the American Air Force, who knew about Auschwitz, chose not to bomb it. And Macron talking, going on and on about the Holocaust, about anti-Semitism, mentioning in one word, in a very vague sentence, France's responsibility, not mentioning Vichy, not mentioning French gendarmes pushing Jews into cattle carts and so on. And Prince Charles, again, England, the Allies, everything's fine. But when we talk about the British mandate in Palestine, let me just remind you 2 marine disaster catastrophes, the Surma and the Patria, which could have been avoided if the British mandate would have acted otherwise. So when we talk about these speeches, I feel that this is not a ceremony. This is a laundromat that washes the crimes of these states.
On that line, it'd be interesting to hear from the German representative, President Frank-Walter Steinmeier. Obviously, we'll be listening closely to him. Ambassador Ravner, on Vladimir Putin, not poking at Poland, as we had some suspicion that he did his homework. I mean, he came with some stats about some 40% of the Jews that perished came from Soviet lands. So clearly, really investing a bit in his words here today. What struck you about Vladimir Putin's address?
Well, actually, his previous address, the earlier one at the inauguration, was very emotional. He was on the verge of tears.
That way. Speaking about his brother.
Indeed, when he talked about his 3-year-old brother who died of hunger in besieged Leningrad. So it was quite remarkable, I have to say. I haven't seen him in such a state of emotional state. And also here, very clever. By the way, if you said we should not refer to Poland, but nevertheless, I think that the Polish president, has he been here today, Putin's speech was okay as far as the proposal. And here I have to disagree. This is not a historical conference. This is not a seminar here. These are statements. Indeed, you cannot expect those leaders to be sort of self-exposing their history setup. There is a place for it, but the message here is different. One couldn't expect them to do so. It's nice that the French mentioned the responsibility of French government at the time, but on the whole, what is more important is the message to the future. Indeed, to talk about the crimes of these countries, who, after all, fought, who more, who less, fought and beaten the beast, the Nazi beast. What about the others, including some of those 49 who are attending, and about their countries and nations who either did or helped or corroborated or simply were indifferent? So we cannot expect them to self-expose themselves to such issue here on this account.
French President Macron speaking so much about memory, preserving the memory, on the heels of his sort of PR disaster yesterday in Jerusalem, yelling at Israeli security. He goes to Ramallah to visit with Mahmoud Abbas. Was a doctorate in essentially denying the veracity of the details of the Holocaust. How does he appear today to you, giving this speech?
I would prefer to speak about some other countries, not about Macron and his long-winded speech and whether or not he should have been invited to speak, which is another question. I want to talk about the countries who are participating here and who are busy at the same time totally distorting the history of the Holocaust. Lithuania, there's talk of submitting a proposed law to the Seimas, to the Lithuanian Parliament, which would assert that neither the Lithuanian government nor the Lithuanian nation participated in any way in the Holocaust. Now, I can't think of a more outrageous step than such a law. I mean, this is ridiculous, outrageous, in a country where 212,000 out of 220,000 Jews living under the Nazi occupation were murdered. and many of them, if not most of them, by their Lithuanian neighbors, in a process that encompassed all strata of Lithuanian society, which is exactly contrary to the narrative presented in Lithuania, where they don't deny that the Holocaust took place. They just said the Germans came and killed our Jews.
Similar to what we've seen in Poland.
No, Latvia, right. Estonia, right. Croatia, Belarus, Ukraine. These are all countries that are lying, plain simply lying, with 4 goals in mind. One is to hide or minimize their collaboration. And keep in mind that only in Eastern Europe did collaboration with the Nazis include participation in systematic mass murder, okay? 2, they're trying to promote the canard of equivalency between communism and Nazism, and to insist that communism is genocide, because if that's the case, then Jews committed genocide. And if Jews committed genocide, how can we complain about what they did? In other words, if everyone's guilty, no one's guilty.
We're going to cut in. Sorry to cut you here. We're going back to hear from Walter Steinmeier here, the representative from Germany, president of Germany, now taking the stage. Let's listen.
Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam shehecheleranu vekiyamanu והגיענו לזמן הזה. זו מתנה ומעשה של חסד
It is a gift and a gift of mercy to be able to address you here at Yad Vashem on this day. The Excellency, Professor Rivlin, President Rivlin, and Dr. Moshe Cantor, thank you for your invitation.
Excellencies, guests from all over the world, and most of all, esteemed witnesses and survivors of the Shoah. Here at Yad Vashem burns the eternal flame in remembrance of the victims of the Shoah. This place reminds us of their suffering, the suffering of millions, and it reminds us of their lives, each individual life. This place remembers Samuel Titelmann, a keen swimmer who won competitions for Maccabi Warsaw, and his little sister Riga, who helped her mother prepare the family meal for Shabbos. This place remembers Ida Goldish and her 3-year-old son, Willy. In October, they were deported from Chisinau ghetto, and in January, in the bitter cold, Ida wrote her last letter to her parents. I quote, "I regret from the very depths of my soul that on departing, I did not realize the importance of the moment, that I did not hug you tightly, never releasing you from my arms." Germans deported them. Germans burned numbers on their forearms. Germans tried to dehumanize them, to reduce them to numbers, to erase all memory of them in the extermination camps. They did not succeed. Samuel and Riga, Ida and Willy were human beings, and as human beings, they live on in our memory. Yad Vashem gives them, as it says in the book of Isaiah, a monument and a name. I too stand before this monument as a human being and as a German. I stand before their monument. I read their names. I hear their stories. And I bow in deepest sorrow. Samuel and Riga, Ida and Willy were human beings. And this also must be said here. The perpetrators were human beings. They were Germans. Those who murdered, those who planned and helped in the murdering, and the many who silently towed the line, they were Germans. The industrial mass murder of 6 million Jews, the worst crime in the history of humanity, it was committed by my countrymen. The terrible war, which cost far more than 50 million lives, is originated from my country. 75 years later, after the liberation of Auschwitz, I stand before you all as President of Germany, and I stand here laden with the heavy historical burden of guilt. Yet, at the same time, my heart is filled with gratitude. Gratitude for the hands of the survivors stretched out to us. Gratitude for the new trust given to us by people in Israel and across the world. Gratitude for Jewish life is flourishing again in Germany. My soul is moved by this spirit of reconciliation, a spirit which opened up a new and peaceful path for Germany and Israel, for Germany, Europe, and the countries of the world. The eternal flame at Yad Vashem does not go out. Germany's responsibility does not expire. We want to live up to our responsibility. By this, dear friends, you should measure us. I stand before you grateful for this miracle of reconciliation, and I wish I could say that our remembrance has made us immune to evil. Yes, we Germans remember, but sometimes it seems as though we understand the past better than the present. The spirits of evil are emerging in a new guise, presenting their anti-Semitic, racist, authoritarian thinking as an answer for the future, a new solution to the problems of our age. And I wish I could say that we Germans have learned from history once and for all. But I cannot say that when hatred is spreading. I cannot say that when Jewish children are spat on in the schoolyard. I cannot say that when crude anti-Semitism is cloaked in supposed criticism of Israeli policy. And I cannot say that, ladies and gentlemen, when only a thick wooden door prevents a right-wing terrorist from causing a massacre, a bloodbath in a synagogue in the city of Halle on Yom Kippur. Of course, our age is a different age. The words are not the same. The perpetrators are not the same. But it is the same evil. And there remains only one answer. Never again, nie wieder. That is why there cannot be an end to remembrance. This responsibility was woven into the very fabric of the Federal Republic of Germany from day one. But it tests us here and now. This Germany will only live up to itself if it lives up to its historical responsibility. We fight anti-Semitism. We resist to the poison that is nationalism. We protect Jewish life. We stand with Israel. And here in Yad Vashem, I renew this promise before the eyes of the world. And I know that we are not alone. Today we join together to say no to anti-Semitism, no to hatred. From the horror of Auschwitz, the world learned lessons once before. The nations of the world built an order of peace founded upon human rights and international law. We Germans are committed to this order, and we want to defend it with all of you, because this we know: peace can be destroyed and people can be corrupted. Esteemed heads of state and government, I'm grateful that together we make this commitment today: a world that remembers the Holocaust, a world without genocide. Who knows? Who knows if we will ever hear again the magical sound of life? Who knows if we can weave ourselves into eternity? Who knows? Salman Gradowski wrote these lines in Auschwitz and buried them in a tin can under the crematorium. Here at Yad Vashem, they are woven into eternity. Salman Gradowski, Samuel and Riga Titelmann, Ida and Willy Goldisch, and so many others. They were all murdered. Their lives were lost to unfettered hatred, but our remembrance of them will defeat the abyss, and our action will defeat hatred. Ladies and gentlemen, by this I stand. For this I hope. Baruch atah Adonai, shechayanu bekimanu vehigyanu lazman hazeh.
Blessed be the God that we have reached and enabled us to be here.
And to our viewers here watching the 75th year of liberation of Auschwitz memorial ceremony taking place here at Yad Vashem in Jerusalem. Here we're covering the entire thing live for you today here at i24NEWS. That was German President Frank-Walter Steinmeier delivering his address to the assembly, and we've already heard from Israeli President Rivlin, Prime Minister Netanyahu, as well as Vladimir Putin from Russia, and Emmanuel Macron from France, as well as Vice President Pence from the United States. And I'm sure I'm leaving someone else out. Prince Charles from the UK also, yes, spoke. For our viewers that may be just tuning in here, I want to reintroduce you to our guests who have been joining us here very diligently throughout all these speeches here. We're joined by Ambassador Tzvi Ravner. He's the former Israeli ambassador to Poland. Ephraim Zuroff, he's the head of the Simon Wiesenthal Center in Jerusalem. And Dr. Liat Stier-Livni, she's author and senior lecturer at the Department of Culture at Superior College. Thank you all for...
and the Open University.
And the Open University, yes. Thank you for sitting through all these speeches here, staying awake for all of them. Some have been more interesting and consequential than others. I found Steinmeier's speech to be, just before the break, we were talking about culpability. We were talking about taking responsibility. His speech was full of that. Did it strike you as being on the right tone, the right substance for a speech from the German representative today?
Yeah, a speech that echoed truth and reality. He used the forbidden word guilt. Right. How hard it is to use this word, and I would like to address these two topics of education and legislation that Moshe Cantor spoke about earlier. Ephraim talked about this proposed legislation in Lithuania, which is horrendous, and before that we saw this video with testimonies of the survivors, and if this video is broadcasted in 49 states, then educational-wise it's highly important. Now, we spoke about these speeches. We are in an era when we fight over narratives. The historical event has ended. The survivors are dying. What we are left to deal with is the narratives. And if we listen to these state leaders like Putin and Macron and so on, we get a very partial image of the Holocaust. These people completely marginalized the collaboration. There were large amounts of collaboration from East and from West. The Holocaust was initiated by the Germans, but was committed on the purposes by many others, and the states must acknowledge it if we want to receive a whole version of the Holocaust. Otherwise, it's partial, and I would say almost half a lie.
Ambassador, do you share those thoughts that this was, earlier you were disagreeing a little, that this isn't the forum for these types of grievances or the historical narrative to be gone over?